Hi everyone, and welcome back to Bowdie Shorts, making law make sense in 15 minutes or less. In the last episode, we looked at intention to create legal relations and saw that not every agreement is intended to be legally binding. Today, we're looking at the third and final building block of a binding contract, namely consideration. And this is a topic that often sounds more complicated than it really is. Students hear words like sufficient consideration, adequate consideration, executory consideration, the concept of promissory estoppel, and immediately assume they're heading into deep legal waters. But the heart of consideration is actually very simple. The key question is, what is each party giving in return? If you can answer that question, most consideration problems become much easier. So let's get started. Start off here with firstly the big picture. Remember our three requirements for a binding contract: agreement, intention to create legal relations, consideration. Agreement gives us the deal. Intention makes it legally binding. Consideration explains why each party should be able to enforce the other's promise. And that's where today's topic begins. So what's consideration? At its simplest, consideration means something given in return for a promise. The law generally says if you want to hold somebody to their promise, you must have given something in return. That something in return is consideration. Now, whenever you face a consideration problem, ask yourself, what is each party giving in return? And let's use a simple example. I agreed to sell a laptop for £500. What am I giving? Well, the laptop. What are you giving? £500. Both parties are giving something. Both parties are providing consideration, and therefore both parties can enforce the contract. Let's quickly look at promises and acts. So consideration can take two forms. Sometimes it is a promise, and sometimes it is an act. Most contracts involve promises exchanged for promises. For example, I promise to sell and I promise to buy. And lawyers call this executory consideration because the promises are still waiting to be performed. At this point, it'd be important to touch upon unilateral contracts. Now, sometimes a promise is exchanged for an act. For example, if you find my dog, I'll pay you £100. The consideration is not another promise. The consideration is the act of finding the dog, and lawyers call this executed consideration because the act has actually been performed. Now we need to look at adequate and sufficient, and these are often confused by students, but they are not the same thing. So the first thing is that consideration needs to be adequate. So think of adequacy as value. Does the thing given in return have the same value as the promise received? Now, the law doesn't usually care. Suppose I sell you an Aston Martin for £1. Terrible deal? Probably. Valid consideration? Yes. Why? Well, because £1 still has value. The law generally allows people to make good bargains and bad bargains. It is not the court's job to rescue people from poor commercial decisions. Next, we then get to sufficiency, and sufficiency is different. This isn't about value. It's about whether the thing given is the right sort of thing to count as consideration. So the law wants something that resembles a genuine exchange. Money, goods, services, promises. They are all perfectly normal examples, and the courts are generally looking for something that forms part of a real bargain between the parties. Now, one way of thinking about consideration is benefit or detriment. The promisee may suffer a detriment. The promisor may receive a benefit. Sometimes both occur at the same time. The key point is that something of legal value must be given in return. We're now going to look at public duties, and this is where the topic starts to become interesting. Suppose somebody promises to pay you for something you are already legally required to do. Have you been given consideration? Usually not. Why? because you haven't actually provided anything new. You're simply doing what the law already requires. But what if you do more than you're already required to do? Now things change. If you exceed your legal duty, the law recognises that you have provided something extra. That additional effort can amount to consideration. A useful rule to remember is doing what you're already obliged to do is not usually consideration. Doing more than you're obliged to do usually is. Now, another favourite SQE topic is past consideration. So imagine this. As a favour, you help a friend move house. Afterwards, they say, "Thanks, I'll give you £100. Can you enforce the promise? Usually not. Why? Because the act happened before the promise. You didn't move the furniture in return for the £100. You moved it as a favour. The consideration came before the promise. And lawyers summarise this with a famous phrase: past consideration is not good consideration. Why? Well, because consideration is supposed to be part of an exchange, something given in return. If the act happened before the promise was ever made, there was no exchange at all. Now we move to the area where consideration causes most problems, that area being contractual variations. So suppose the parties already have a contract, then one side wants to change it. What is required? Well, exactly the same three ingredients: agreement, intention, consideration. The challenge is that consideration often becomes difficult to identify. So let's start with the earlier scenario. An employer says, "Complete the work on time and I'll pay you extra." And that question immediately becomes, what is the contractor giving in return? Traditionally, the answer would be nothing new. The contractor is already contractually obliged to complete the work, so where is the consideration? Well, the traditional rule is performing an existing contractual duty is not consideration for a promise to pay more. You're already required to do it. So you're not providing anything additional. But if the contractor does more than originally promised, consideration clearly exists. Additional work means additional detriment, and that additional detriment is therefore consideration. Now, modern contract law has softened the traditional rule. The courts recognise that sometimes one party obtains a very real, practical benefit from promising additional payment. For example, avoiding delay, avoiding penalties, avoiding the expense of finding a replacement contractor. Where a genuine practical benefit exists, consideration may be found. For SQE purposes, this is often the key issue. So you should ask, has the promisor obtained a real practical benefit? If yes, the variation may be binding. Now we need to turn that situation around. Suppose a creditor is owed £1,000. The debtor offers £700 in full settlement and the creditor agrees. Is the creditor bound by that promise? Generally, no. Simply paying part of an existing debt is not consideration for a promise to waive the rest. Why? Because the debtor is already obliged to pay the money. Nothing new has been provided. So how can the rule be avoided? Well, the debtor needs to provide something different. Not necessarily something valuable, just something new. For example, early payment, different property, another benefit requested by the creditor, and that additional element where it may provide the consideration that would otherwise be lacking. And this brings us to the final topic, promissory estoppel. And this is one of the most important safety nets in contract law. The idea is simple. Suppose somebody promises not to enforce their strict legal rights. Another person relies on that promise. It may then be unfair to allow the promisor to go back on their word. In those circumstances, the courts may prevent them from insisting upon their original legal rights. Now, promissory estoppel is really about fairness. The law says if somebody reasonably relies on your promise, it may be unfair for you to abandon that promise later. And for SQE purposes, remember promissory estoppel usually arises when consideration is missing, but fairness strongly supports the promise being honoured. So what's Bowdie's bottom line? Well, every consideration problem starts with one question. What is every party giving in return? Then work through the main principles. Consideration can be a promise or an act. Consideration must be sufficient, need not be adequate, but must not usually be in the past. For contractual variations, doing more than what you've already required to do can be consideration. A practical benefit may be consideration, and part payment of a debt is generally not consideration for accepting less. And finally, promissory estoppel may prevent a party from going back on a promise where it would be unfair to do so. If you can identify what is being exchanged, you'll be able to deal with the vast majority of SQE consideration questions. Thank you for watching this episode of Bowdie Shorts. There'll be further videos in our series available